Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick Dubois. Coming up on the show, the Tories say they've halved inflation. But do they deserve the credit? Because the cost of living crisis isn't going away, forcing shoppers to think twice about splashing the cash this Christmas.
Mr. Speaker, I come today with good news.
Chancellor Jeremy Hunt hailed his autumn statement as proof the UK had turned a corner, as the government celebrated meeting their target of halving inflation by the end of the year. He announced cuts to a range of taxes, including national insurance for the self-employed, as well as 110 measures to unlock investment in the UK. But the tax burden is actually increasing to an estimated 37% of GDP by next year. That's the highest since 1948. And inflation remains well above the Bank of England's target rate of 2%. The cost of living crisis still hasn't gone away, with the public still feeling the effects of many daily items becoming more expensive. The latest ONS figures show that although prices are easing, food is around 30% more expensive than 2 years ago. That's not all. Retail sales volumes, or the number of products being bought by consumers, have dropped to their lowest level since February 2021, when the country was in the middle of a lockdown. And almost 2/3 of adults in Britain are spending less on non-essential items because of the rising cost of living. Now, let's bring in our panel. Roger Gievold is a financial entrepreneur and promotes consumer finance industry fairness. Catherine McBride is a senior economist and author who called for MPs to deliver on Brexit. And we also have with us political and social commentator Lizzie Zita. Welcome to you all. Roger, let me start off with you, if I may. Much fanfare from the Conservative government. They say they've met their target of halving inflation, in fact, beating the target, which was to deliver that by the end of the year. Now, they get the blame when inflation is high. Let's be fair. Don't they deserve the credit for reducing this inflation with their policies?
I'm afraid not, at least as far as I'm concerned. We have non-consumer-driven inflation. It's called cost-push inflation. You can't stop people buying food and heating their homes by making money more expensive for them. It's about as stupid a thing as anybody affecting monetary policy can do. Back in 2009, we had a similar situation. The people then running the Bank of England left rates alone for almost 3 years till the inflation ran itself out. Cost plus inflation always runs itself out as long ago as wheat starting to grow again in ancient biblical Egypt. The 14 interest rate rises that the Bailey-osaurus and his other thick-skinned friends...
You're talking about the governor of the Bank of England.
I am. That he and his other thick-skinned friends who won't listen have foisted upon us. Those 14 interest rate rises have not only severely damaged the economy, the property market, the mortgage market, the rental market, destroyed the bank of mom and dad, made it almost impossible for young people, first-time buyers, to get on the property ladder. Think tanks predict many tens of thousands of businesses will go bankrupt in the next 12 to 24 months. All completely unnecessary because they did nothing to curb inflation. When I started predicting at the time of the second rate rise, Mr. Bailey, please stop doing this. It's insane, as many others are saying. I also said, watch, when it falls by itself. Oh, and by the way, the 14 rises prolonged the time when it fell by itself and created the damage that makes our inflation so much worse than what's going on in Europe and the States. I said at the time, watch, when it falls by itself, Bailey, Sunak, and Hunt will all claim credit for it, quite wrongfully. So now it has fallen. In the States, they have demand pull inflation, which is consumer driven. They have $1.7 trillion under the mattresses that was squirreled away during the pandemic, which is being spent with alacrity.
So they'd be right in the US
Boom.
to put the interest rates
Boom.
up.
And when they did, inflation fell by more than a half almost overnight.
So, Catherine, you know, if we accept Roger's thesis, what he's just put forward there are things that governments can do to bring down inflation, though, aren't they? And if we look at Brexit, I well remember the claims made that Nigel Farage instead, I've got it here, he said, we will open ourselves up to the world, we can get rid of the common external tariff and buy cheaper food. What's happened to that?
Yeah. What's happened to that? That's a very good question. I would agree 100%, by the way, with what we've just heard, except that we do have to look at the money supply. While Sunak was Chancellor, he really pushed out the money supply. That had a big effect. And if you look on the ONS's website, they have a wonderful graph from Eurostat, so it's not even a Brexiteer making this up, of France, Germany, the UK, the EU 27, and the US's inflation, and it's a harmonised system index. And the UK and Germany pretty much went up to the same peak, and they're now coming down. France never had that peak. And the big difference between France and Germany and the UK is the cost of energy. And that's because France is very heavily a nuclear power, and Germany and the UK rely so heavily on gas. And then just when, I mean, not only do I believe a monetarist, but I'm also a free market economist, and I believe 100% in markets to basically work, and they make, as the price gets higher, people use less, and when it gets lower, they produce more, and then it comes down. And you need to get that produce more. And that is the real problem. At a point where we had very high gas prices last year because of what was happening in Russia and the Ukraine, we actually made it more expensive for our own producers to produce gas by putting these ridiculous taxes on. Now, I 100% agree that the Bank of England, since 1997, has been an independent, and they're meant to be in charge of inflation. And I don't think they've been doing a very good job of it recently. And that's not just Bailey, that's the one before him as well. But the interesting thing is that the government does do some things, and putting taxes up on our gas and oil producers was insane. At a time of shortage, you actually should pay them to produce more. You should give them tax breaks for every
Sure, but energy feeds through, as we know, into a lot of inflationary things.
Everything. Everything is energy.
But in a nutshell, a government can control how much money we have in our pockets through taxation and all sorts of measures. Why is the government so reluctant to sort of abolish some of these tariffs now we're out of the EU? That was the promise. What's stopping them? Is there an economic reason that I'm missing?
No, it's complete insanity. It is the fact that the farmers' lobby is hugely successful in terms of lobbying, not just Parliament, but also getting stories into the Daily Mail. Even the trade deals we did with Australia and New Zealand didn't actually start till June this year. So even though you heard a lot about them, a year after they were agreed, they have to scrutinise everything. They have to go through a ratification process, and this is very, very slow. The CPTPP, which has been signed, and the scrutiny finished last night, that won't come into effect until about June next year.
And this is the biggest trade deal yet that the UK government have signed.
In terms of expensive food, the thing that the EU tariffs do is not so much make our food more expensive. They actually prevent us from buying cheaper food because the tariff makes the prices equivalent, whether you buy Italian olive oil or Turkish olive oil. The £1,300 per tonne tariff we put on it means that you may as well buy the Italian oil. So it basically forces us to buy the high-cost EU product rather than the cheaper cost of a product coming in from places in North Africa or now the CPTPP countries. They did have trade deals with places like Peru, Chile and Mexico who grow a lot of our vegetables.
And did they make a difference for consumers?
Well, the trouble is, before they had really small quotas on them. So the quota was about 500 tonnes or something. The UK consumes huge volumes of food and we import about 45% of the food and drink that we eat each year. So the idea that we have to go to the highest cost producer because we've put tariffs on all the low cost producers, or we've excluded them with some sort of regulation, just keeps not only our food prices high, but it keeps them in line with Europe.
OK, Lizzie, come in, yes.
No, I was just going to say that I completely agree with everything that I've heard so far, in particular what you said, Roger. And people are suffering so much. Yesterday, I saw my hairdresser and I said, how is the cost of living crisis affecting you? And I wrote down what she said, if I could read it out, if that's OK.
Yeah.
It's very short.
It's not an essay.
No, not at all. She said it used to cost me £50 to fill my car. Now I never fill it up, but it would cost me £75 to do so. My food bill was about £300 a month. Now this only lasts 2 weeks. Exactly what you were saying. In Iceland, which is supposed to be cheap, with £100, my trolley used to overflow. Now it's less than half. There are no luxuries. I would consider a luxury something like a nice toothpaste. There are 4 to 5 people in my household, and we all used to have a favourite ice cream. This used to be our family thing. Now it's just one flavour. Buying clothes for myself is a luxury I cannot afford. Kids' shoes are the same price as adult shoes. I'm OK for Christmas presents this year, as I started to buy bargains back in January. There are no holidays at all, and I really struggle to buy fruit for my daughter.
OK, so now we're seeing it through the lens of the consumer, what all this talk we've been making about inflation means. Roger, I'm confused. OK, now I live in the southeast. This may be something to do with it. I struggle to get a table at a restaurant. I leave from an airport, it's heaving with people. If I want to go into London on a Friday night, there's more people going to the theatre than ever before, from what I can tell, packing the trains. And yet, we're hearing exactly what Lizzie said, how it's hurting. How is this cost of living crisis materialising for people? Are they just making decisions to spend more on credit than ever before?
I think that possibly not on credit, but I think that part of what you say is true, that people are just outspending money because the situation is so fluid and troubled, and we have a government that's clearly beleaguered. Every time I type Sunak on an email, a predictive text comes up sunk. So, you know, and then we've got a Labour Party, which looks like it will be even worse. It's tax, tax, tax. You know, the choice between Hunt and Reeves is cut and cut, or cut and paste. You know, it's.
But do you think, Lizzie?
If I can just finish, I think the real problems are raising interest rates, and Mr. Bailey is saying that we're going to keep rates where they are to combat inflation. Well, sir, you're not combating inflation. It's going down by itself. The longer you keep the rates up, the more you're going to persist on having your foot on our throat. The Bank of England needs to start slowly lowering rates now. Number 2, energy is the second thing, and we need to decouple the price. We need to decouple the price of gas, electricity, from gas. 2/3 of our energy bills at home are electricity. 100% of the cost of that is tied to gas from conventions going back to the 80s. Whereas only some days 20% of our electricity comes from gas. Our electricity is way cheaper than it is. When the average cost was said to be £2,800 per household, think tanks said that if they decoupled, we'd save £1,500 per house at the time. They need to reduce VAT, at least temporarily, and they need to do something about the fuel duty, which is ridiculous.
OK, before that, Lizzie, I'm still a bit confused, because it's very hard to disagree with what Roger's saying, but why are my restaurants still full and I can't get a table? I know I sound like a real first world problem here, but there does seem to be an appetite to spend despite everything we're
Well,
hearing.
it's like Dickens said, it's a tale of two cities. On the one hand, you have people really struggling if you are a normal job in person. The middle classes are pulling their belt in, but the upper classes and the people who have money continue as they always have. So it's kind of, you know, I looked at the figures for luxury sales, 4.25% they've gone up. That's luxury sales. The biggest consumers of luxuries, USA and Korea. But there is still a band of people that just will continue going, whatever happens.
I was going to...
Catherine, if I may,
There is another section to that, is if you actually look, the whole idea of moving the interest rate around to control spending really started in the 80s when pretty much everyone was anchored to a mortgage. And we didn't have any fixed mortgages in this country at the time. It was pretty much all variable rate mortgages. Now, if you look at the Bank of England's own statistics, you'll see that the proportion of mortgages are dropping because the younger generation can't afford a house at all, and the older generation's mortgages from the 80s and the 90s are now disappearing completely. So our loan-to-value rate is actually quite good, which means there's a whole lot of there's 28 million households in the country, and there's only about half of them have a mortgage at all. So there's a lot of people for whom the interest rate isn't really affecting their spending, which is why if they are raising rates to change spending habits, there's half the households are not being affected. And the other half are being squeezed blind.
But then the renters are being affected.
It's killing the new house market. So people can't afford a new house.
The cost of these interest rates hit businesses, and the businesses pass on the prices just as they've passed on Jeremy Hunt's 1/3 corporation tax increase within 2 weeks. I was going to finish answering your question by saying it is a tale of two cities. There's 68 million of us here, after all. So, yeah, London is packed with, you know, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of theatre goers, and you can't get into a restaurant. But the rest of the country, I mean, you just spend your time up north, as I do sometimes, a lot, and you'll just see the difference.
Oh, I 100% agree on the tax thing, but on the interest rate thing, it's just not biting the population as it used to.
It is. There are seven times more savers than there are mortgage holders. And again, this government and successive governments, previous governments, have never passed on the benefit of those interest rate rises to the savers, so it hits everybody.
Let me give you some statistics, Lizzie, and I'll bring you in on this point, is that according to Step Change, which just published its YouGov poll, it said essentially that equivalent of around 1 million people said they would not be celebrating Christmas at all due to the cost, which is a small number but significant. And yet in October, 26% of shoppers, so people who are already shopping effectively, said they intend to spend more at Christmas. So, you know, we hear a lot about the cost of living crisis. It dominates and drives the news. But this idea of a tale of two cities, if you like, we're only speaking to a relatively small number of people.
The gap
so
is
does
growing.
it matter?
Well, but the gap is growing, and also let's mention the renters. Rental arrears the rent has gone crazy high because 30% of UK buy-to-let owners have gotten out of the market because of all the restrictions, because of all the ridiculously high taxes that are placed on them. They should be taxed the same as every other business. So they've gotten out of the market. They've been absolutely vilified in the press, saying that all landlords are evil, etc., etc. It's not true. Yes, there's some very bad ones. Let's prosecute them, get them into court very quickly. But the rent is going sky high. People cannot afford to rent. People are moving out of the cities and they're going outside of London because of these prices. So it does affect them. Can I also say the inflation rate in this country is currently 4.6%. Across Europe, 3.6%. Now, part of that is the mortgages. They can fix their mortgages for 25 years and 30 years. How wonderful. Happy days. I'm coming off my fixed interest rate next Christmas and I'm concerned about it. It's gone up so much, so much.
Is the worst yet to come?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely.
There is another issue. It's the demand push, because our population has gone up by 1.4 million people in 2 years. And those people eat and they need a place to live. You know, this idea that they're all here to help the NHS, well, maybe, but they still need to live somewhere. So their rent, you're right, is absolutely through the roof because we've got even more people
Rents in
looking.
London have gone up by 40% in some cases.
And more and more people are looking for a place to...
Let me, if I may, just move this on. Catherine, I'll start with you, if I may, because to someone who's lived through 2 or 3 recessions, I would be tempted to say that the inflation cycle that we are going through at the moment has had the effect, particularly because of Brexit on terms of use of immigrant labour, of pushing wages up. People have frankly had to pay more to their staff.
Yeah.
Now, in the long term, isn't that a good thing? Because if you've got less immigration to call on, as we know has been the case since Brexit to a degree, and you're paying people more, whilst that might have a short-term inflationary cycle, it's got to be good for the economy in the long term because people are going to have more money, aren't they, to spend?
Well, it would be if that was the case.
Yeah.
And of course,
Exactly.
it would be, but that's why they're bringing in 1 million people to, so that the whole idea of Brexit, people claimed it was about racism. It was never about racism. Almost all Europeans are the same races as the people in the UK, but they were undercutting because if you come from Eastern Europe, you could earn, even at the minimum wage, more than you were getting for a professional wage in the country you came from. You know, from Romania to the UK, it was originally about 2.5 times difference after tax and after the cost of living adjustment. So, of course, people came here. But that brought down our wages, and that meant people had less money. And that was the real reason, I think, that most Brexit voters who claimed that immigration was their problem, it was a problem for them because they were being undercut. And I worked in this building during the referendum on the telephone exchange at Vote Leave, and we were canvassing around the country. And if you rang outside of London, you would get people from truck drivers to bank managers telling you about how they had
Not to mention tradesmen.
and tradesmen all being undercut by people coming in from Eastern Europe.
Why then, if we're going to start paying people more, inflation is coming down, real terms incomes are going up. I know you laughed at the suggestion, but isn't this actually quite good to be paying people more money?
Because what you're saying is a soundbite. It's a newspaper headline. Real wages haven't increased in over 15 years.
No, they haven't.
And you don't see that happening now, even though there's been an uplift because of the inflation.
I think in the last figures that they were finally higher than...
a few months, so that's a blip.
Yeah, it's a blip. But,
Lizzie.
But Nick, the cost of food has increased 30% since 2019 when we were in lockdown. 30%. Now, your wages may go up, but if everything else is going sky high, if your rent is sky high, if your mortgage is sky high because you've come off your fixed rates, and the fuel is sky high, where do you go? Where do you go? I think that's what's happening more than anything else.
And I think that's a good point. The government likes to talk about something they call core inflation. But for real people, we don't care about core inflation because we can not buy those things. Those are discretionary spending in general. The inflation of food and energy hits everyone. That is the stuff that everyone cares about because whether you're renting, whether you own a house, you have to eat and you have to heat your house in this country. You can't sort of...
OK, one final question for you, Lizzie. The Bank of England governor came out and criticised price hiking by companies, particularly supermarkets on the fuel retails. He said that you're basically ripping people off. Let me put it to you like this. The agony that people are going through now that we've been talking about, has capitalism failed people?
Well, I'm never one to... My father fought the communists in 1956. I'm never one to advocate the other side. But in this instance, I think it has. I mean, for example, there is a scandal brewing about formula milk because only 2 companies sell formula milk for babies, for infants, and it's really expensive. Now, what do? You cannot not buy it, and it's very, very expensive. Things like Tampaxes and sanitary products, there was supposed to have been a reduction in tax. It was not passed on to the consumers. So I think that these supermarkets, if they are found to be price fixing, should be prosecuted.
Okay, so
can I say one thing in defence of them?
Well, maybe,
because
but is
the
it the
government has
government
pushed
that's
up
failed?
tax, as we've already heard. The government put the tax up basically from 19 to 25%, which was massive. So what they took off in things like the VAT on sanitary products ended up going back in company tax. So that the government and energy, every supermarket has not only keep the lights on, the refrigeration is very expensive. Their store, outside of the stores in the big warehouses, that's all refrigerated. That's very expensive. It's amazing how if you look at the cost of energy, it feeds into everything.
Yes, it does.
The UK has the third highest
Yes, it does.
electricity prices in the developed world.
What I would say is that is precisely where we started, and that is precisely where we're going to finish. Thank you to you, Catherine McBride, Lizzie Sita and Roger Gievold. Thank you very much for joining me. And don't forget to check out TRT World on YouTube for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.